Have you ever wondered how a century of war reshaped two great nations, across fields soaked in arrows and thrones claimed by kings? The 100 Years' War tells a story of ambition, betrayal, and unbreakable resolve. From the rise of English longbowmen at Crécy to the divine fire of Joan of Arc at Orléans, this was no ordinary war. It was an epic unfolding over generations. France and England were locked in a battle not just for land, but for legitimacy itself. Castles burned, cities fell, and heroes emerged from the ashes of plague and ruin. In tonight's journey through medieval Europe, we'll walk alongside black-armored knights and peasant archers, listen to the whisper of ancient treaties, and feel the thunder of war drums echoing across centuries. So lie back, close your eyes, and let the past speak. Subscribe now to Sleep Stories TV for more history told under moonlight. The roots of the war lay in feudal tensions and dynastic claims. For many years, kings of England ruled not only their island realm, but also held large territories on the continent. These lands, such as Gascony, Aquitaine, and Ponthieu, were legally fiefs of the French crown. That meant the English king was also a vassal to the King of France. This situation was not just awkward, it was explosive. No sovereign king wanted to kneel before another, even in name. The arrangement created confusion, insult, and deep resentment on both sides. England had inherited these lands through a complex web of marriages and past wars. Some of them stretched back to the time of William the Conqueror, who invaded England from Normandy in 1066. From that point forward, the kings of England carried the legacy of their Norman roots. But as generations passed, the French monarchy grew stronger. It slowly chipped away at English holdings. By the early 14th century, most of the old Angevin Empire was lost. Only Gascony remained under English rule, and even that was under constant threat. Gascony was important. Its wine trade brought enormous wealth. The merchants of Bordeaux and Bayonne sent their goods to England in vast quantities. In return, they received English wool and manufactured products. This mutual trade bound the two regions closely. Many Gascons preferred English rule. They spoke their own dialects distinct from the French of Paris. Their loyalty was not to the Capetian crown, but to the English king, who respected their privileges and granted them freedoms. Still, the French court did not see it that way. To them, Gascony was French soil. The English were guests. Their rule was conditional. And when English officials acted too boldly or too independently, the French king would issue warnings or demands. These tensions simmered year after year, like a pot left on the fire. Sometimes they boiled over into local disputes. Sometimes they cooled with temporary treaties, but they never fully disappeared. The situation worsened when the Capetian line faced a crisis. In 1328, King Charles IV died without a male heir. It was a rare and dangerous moment. The French nobility had to choose a successor. There were two main options. One was Edward III of England, the grandson of Philip IV of France through his mother Isabella. The other was Philip of Valois, a cousin from a male line of the royal house. The French chose Philip. They cited an old rule Salic law, which barred inheritance through the female line. Edward was furious. He believed his claim was stronger. His mother had been the daughter of a king, but the French nobles insisted. They would not accept a foreign monarch, especially one who already ruled a rival kingdom. They feared English domination and the loss of French independence, and so Philip VI took the throne. At first, Edward pretended to accept the outcome. He even paid homage to the new king as feudal custom required. But it was only a matter of time before that truce crumbled. Conflicts followed quickly. France supported Scotland in its battles against English rule. In response, Edward supported rebels and exiles from France. One of them, Robert of Artois, was a French noble accused of murder and forgery. He found protection in England. The French saw this as an outrage. They demanded his surrender. Edward refused. He granted Robert lands, titles, and honors. It was a clear act of defiance. The balance was breaking. Then came the final blow. In 1337, Philip VI formally declared that the Duchy of Aquitaine was forfeited. He accused Edward of disobedience and misconduct. It was a bold move. In effect, the French king was stripping the English king of his last major territory in France. Edward could not let this stand. He began to prepare for war. He raised taxes. He summoned allies. He built fleets and gathered troops. Soon armies would march and ships would sail. But beneath the declarations and banners, deeper issues were at play. This was not simply about who ruled which land. It was about the structure of power in medieval Europe. The feudal system was under strain. Kings were becoming more centralized. Nobles were becoming more ambitious. Borders were hardening. Loyalty was shifting from lords to nations. The 100 Years' War would not only decide the fate of two monarchies, it would also reshape the meaning of kingship, loyalty, and identity. By the end of 1337, war had begun. No one expected it to last 100 years, but the old grudges were deep. The alliances were many. The stakes were high. France and England were locked in a struggle that would span generations. It all began with legal claims, feudal customs, and royal pride. It would end with fire steel and a new map of Europe. The question of royal succession lies at the heart of medieval power. Who had the right to wear the crown of France? Who was the true heir when the bloodline of kings ran dry? These were not just matters of law or inheritance. They were matters of war. In 1328, the French throne stood empty. King Charles IV had died without a male heir. He was the last of the direct Capetian kings. That left a vacuum, and into that vacuum stepped two powerful claimants. One of them was Edward III of England. He was only 15 years old when Charles IV died. But through his mother, Queen Isabella of France, he was the grandson of Philip IV. His blood, though passed through a woman, was close to the royal line. The other claimant was Philip of Valois, a cousin of the dead king descended from a male branch of the royal family. Philip was older, more experienced, and most importantly, he was in France. The French nobility faced a choice. Should they accept a foreign boy as king, or a French nobleman from a slightly more distant line? The answer came swiftly. In a gathering of the peers of France, it was decided that the crown would pass to Philip of Valois. They justified this decision using Salic law. According to this ancient Frankish code, no woman could inherit the throne, and no right to rule could pass through a woman. It was a rule based on custom, on male lineage, and on national pride. For the French elite, Salic law was not just legal, it was symbolic. It protected France from foreign influence. It kept the throne within the borders of the realm, and it ensured that no outside power could claim legitimacy through a queen. But for Edward III, the ruling was an insult. He believed that blood was blood. If his mother had royal ancestry, then so did he. And if she had a right to the crown, then he had an even greater one. At first, Edward stayed silent. He was still a teenager, and his mother and her lover, Roger Mortimer, were acting as regents in England. But by 1330, Edward took power into his own hands. He had Mortimer executed and sent his mother into retirement. Now king in both name and fact, Edward began to assert himself. He watched as Philip VI consolidated power across France. He saw the French king support Scotland in its fight against England, and he waited for the right moment to make his move. That moment came in 1337. After years of rising tensions, Philip formally seized Edward's lands in Aquitaine. The French crown accused Edward of disloyalty, of harboring traitors, and of disrespecting his feudal duties. But Edward did not back down. Instead, he made a dramatic claim. In a bold declaration, he stated that he, not Philip, was the rightful king of France. The gloves were off. The War of Crowns had begun. This wasn't just a political stunt. Edward took the claim seriously. He redesigned his royal seal to include the lilies of France. He styled himself as King of England and France, and he expected his subjects and his allies to treat the claim as law. The people of Flanders, who had long-standing trade ties with England, welcomed the idea. So did many Gascons who preferred English rule to Parisian control. Edward's ambition was now fused with a powerful symbol. He was not only defending his lands, he was claiming a birthright. Philip, of course, rejected all of this. He had been king for nearly a decade. He had been crowned, anointed, and accepted by the church. To him, Edward's claim was nothing but rebellion. But the two kings were now locked in a dispute that went far beyond their persons. Their fight became a question of legitimacy. Was royal blood enough to make a king? Or did the law as interpreted by the nobility rule above all? The issue of Salic law would echo across generations. Future French kings would cling to it. English kings would continue to challenge it. And the war that followed would not be a brief affair. It would drag on for decades. Edward's claim would be inherited by his sons and then by his grandsons. Philip's dynasty, the Valois, would fight to keep their crown even in the face of crushing defeats. Neither side would give up. For Edward III, claiming the French crown was not just about pride. It was about power. If he could become king of both realms, he would rule a vast empire. He would control lands from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees. He would dominate trade, dictate alliances, and stand as the most powerful monarch in Western Europe. It was a vision both bold and dangerous, but it came at a cost. To press his claim, Edward had to raise armies, build fleets, and secure alliances. He had to tax his people heavily. He had to face rebellion at home and resistance abroad. And he had to wage war on a scale that no English king had ever attempted before. France, for its part, would rally behind the Valois. It would forge a sense of national identity in response to the English threat. And in doing so, it would become something new, a centralized, determined, and more unified kingdom. the spark had been lit. A boy king's ambition, fueled by a mother's bloodline, had collided with the ancient traditions of a rival realm. Salic law had been used to bar one claim, but in doing so, it opened the door to generations of war. What began as a legal dispute would soon engulf towns, castles, and entire provinces in fire and blood. And through it all, Edward III would press on claiming, marching, and fighting for a crown he believed was his by divine right. When war officially began between England and France, it did not start with grand battles or sieges of mighty castles. It began with fire. The English strategy, at least in the early years, was built on destruction. Edward III knew he could not conquer all of France by force of arms alone, but he could ruin it. His first moves in the war were not to seize cities or fight pitched battles, but to raid. These raids, known as chevauchées, became the trademark of the early conflict. Their goal was simple: burn everything, frighten the people, and make the French king look weak. In Gascony, the English had long experience. The region had been under English control for generations. Its people, especially the merchants and landowners, often supported the English cause. But it was a thin hold. Many towns were lightly garrisoned. Local nobles were divided. France, seeing this vulnerability, launched attacks in the south almost immediately. In response, Edward sent small, fast-moving forces to defend and retaliate. These troops were trained in mobile warfare. They would ride into the countryside, attack villages, steal supplies, and vanish before French forces could catch them. These raids were brutal. English knights, archers, and footmen moved quickly. They looted churches. They slaughtered livestock. They set fire to barns, mills, and orchards. It was not personal. It was calculated. By destroying farmland and resources, they weakened the French king's ability to tax and supply his armies. Entire regions were left desolate. Peasants fled their homes or starved in the fields. The smoke of ruined villages blackened the sky for miles. In the north, the strategy was the same. Edward looked to Flanders, a wealthy and rebellious region, as a natural ally. Flemish merchants had close ties to English wool. Many of them resented French interference in their affairs. So when Edward promised support, some cities welcomed him. In 1339, Edward crossed into the Low Countries. He brought an army with him and made a show of force. Though no great battles were fought that year, the devastation was terrible. The countryside between the coast and the interior was ravaged. French garrisons retreated. Farmers fled. Towns were plundered. It was during this time that Edward began to formalize his claim to the French throne. In Ghent, a major city of Flanders, he declared himself King of France. His seal bore the fleur-de-lis. His banners carried the arms of both England and France. To many onlookers, it seemed the war was growing into something much bigger than a border conflict. It had become a fight for legitimacy, for pride, for dominance over all of Western Europe. But such ambitions required money, a lot of it. Edward had spent a fortune to hire mercenaries, build ships, and supply his campaigns. To raise funds, he borrowed heavily from Italian banks, from English nobles, and even from pawning the crown jewels. The burden on the English treasury was immense. Still, the raids continued. One of the most terrifying features of these chevauchées was their unpredictability. A peaceful village might be working the fields one morning and be in flames by nightfall. English raiders traveled light and struck fast. They avoided large castles or walled towns and instead focused on soft targets. Farms, monasteries, bridges, mills, these were easy to destroy and hard to defend. They offered little military value, but their destruction sent a powerful message. The King of France cannot protect you. In Gascony, the English relied on local support. Many Gascon lords joined the raiding parties. They knew the land, the roads, and the hiding places. They guided English captains through forests and over rivers. In return, they were promised spoils, favors, and protection. Some towns closed their gates to French soldiers. Others actively resisted the French crown. The region became a patchwork of loyalty and betrayal. Neighbors turned against each other. Accusations of treason were common. It was a war of shadows and whispers as much as fire and sword. By the early 1340s, the damage to France's economy was clear. Trade routes had been disrupted. Fields lay fallow. Tax revenues fell. Many local lords could not collect rents because their peasants were dead missing or ruined. The French crown struggled to raise new armies. Its legitimacy began to erode, especially in the eyes of rural communities. If the king could not stop the English from burning the land, what good was his crown? Not all French nobles stood idly by. Some formed regional militias and fought back. There were small skirmishes, ambushes, and retaliatory raids. But the English had one key advantage: mobility. They chose where and when to fight. They avoided prolonged engagements. They knew how to vanish into the hills or retreat to the coast. It was not honorable warfare, but it was effective. These early years of devastation laid the foundation for the next stages of the war. The English had not won any great battles. They had not conquered large cities, but they had made France bleed. They had shaken the confidence of its people and damaged its economy. Most importantly, they had proven that they could strike deep into enemy territory with little resistance. This would embolden Edward and his commanders in the years ahead. The people of France, meanwhile, lived in fear. In some places, villagers built trenches and barricades. In others, they abandoned their homes entirely. Fields became overgrown. Churches fell silent. Trade stopped. The countryside began to look like a wasteland. And still the English came. This was the beginning of a long and terrible war. A war that would consume cities, shatter dynasties, and bring famine and disease in its wake. But for now, it began with fire, and the smell of ash hung in the air. As the war on land grew fiercer, both sides turned their eyes to the sea. Control of the English Channel would decide not only the flow of troops and supplies, but also the safety of entire coastal regions. For England, the Channel was a lifeline. It connected the king to his allies in Flanders and the continent. It protected the realm from invasion. For France, the Channel was a threat. English ships could raid land armies and choke trade routes. The balance of power at sea needed to be decided, and it would be in a battle that would shake the waves from the estuary of the Zwin to the shores of Flanders. The French Navy was strong in the early years of the war. With help from Genoese and Castilian allies, it launched brutal raids along the southern coast of England. Towns like Southampton, Dover, and Rye saw their houses burned and their people taken. Merchants feared to sail. Fishermen stayed home. The English coast, usually quiet and secure, became a place of terror. France hoped to use its fleet to strangle England, and perhaps even prepare an invasion. That threat was very real. Edward III understood this. He had already seen how dangerous the French navy could be. He knew that unless he could control the seas, his campaigns in Flanders and Gascony would be doomed. Supplies would not reach his allies. Troops could not land safely. English ports would burn. So the king acted. He ordered every available ship merchant or warship to be gathered at Orwell in Suffolk. Even vessels from coastal towns were pressed into service. Most were simple cogs, large trading ships with single masts, but they could be armed and used in battle. The fleet was not elegant, but it was determined. English ships were packed with men-at-arms and longbowmen. Their captains were merchants, nobles, and knights. These were not seasoned admirals, but they were hungry for victory. In total, the English force numbered over 100 ships. Edward himself chose to lead them. He wanted to take the fight to the enemy. In June of 1340, the English fleet set sail. Their target was the French Armada, which had anchored in the harbor near the town of Sluys, a key port on the Flemish coast. The French had assembled a mighty force, more than 200 ships, including war galleys from Genoa and large vessels from Castile. They were positioned across the entrance to the port, tightly chained together to block any approach. Their commanders believed the English would never dare to attack them head-on. They were wrong. On June 24th, the English fleet approached Sluys. The sun shone brightly. The sea was calm. The enemy ships stood before them like a wooden wall, their sails furled and their decks bristling with armed men. Edward gathered his captains. He told them there would be no retreat. If they won, England would command the seas. If they lost, the war might be over. His men cheered. They were ready. The English plan was simple but bold. They divided into 3 squadrons and moved in with the wind at their backs. Each English cog carried a mix of knights and longbowmen. As they closed the gap, the archers climbed to the crow's nests and wooden towers built on deck. Then the longbows began to sing. Arrows rained down on the tightly packed French ships. The Genoese crossbowmen tried to return fire, but they were too slow. Many were cut down before they could shoot. Then came the crash. The English ships slammed into the French line. Hooks and grapnels were thrown. Vessels became entangled. The battle turned into a brutal melee ship man against man. English soldiers boarded the French decks, swords and axes in hand. The narrow spaces made the fighting desperate. There was no room to flee. The decks ran red with blood. One by one, the French ships fell. Some were captured. Others were set on fire. A few broke their chains and tried to escape, only to be chased down. The Genoese galleys, sensing disaster, fled early in the battle. The rest of the French fleet was not so lucky. By nightfall, more than 150 of their ships had been destroyed or taken. Thousands of French sailors were dead. Many others were taken prisoner. The harbor was choked with wreckage. Edward had won a stunning victory. His own fleet had taken losses, but the damage to France was far worse. The French navy was crippled. Its power shattered in a single day. England had seized control of the Channel. Trade routes reopened. Invasions were no longer feared. The war could now be carried to the continent with speed and force. The Battle of Sluys changed the course of the war. It proved that naval power mattered just as much as armies. It showed the effectiveness of longbowmen even at sea, and it gave England a vital edge. With control of the water, Edward could now reinforce his allies, send supplies, and return home when needed. The victory also boosted morale. Back in England, people celebrated. The king was hailed as a hero. For France, it was a bitter defeat. Its best sailors and ships were gone. Its coastal towns were now exposed. Trade slowed. Confidence faltered. Philip VI, the French king, faced criticism from his nobles. He had underestimated his enemy and paid the price. But the war was far from over. Though the English had won the sea, the land remained contested. Armies still gathered. Fortresses still stood. Fields would still be soaked in blood. Yet the Battle of Sluys had given England time to plan to move and to strike again. And so, with the channel secured, Edward looked south once more. The flames of war would soon rise again. In the summer of 1346, Edward III launched one of the most daring campaigns of the war. With the channel secured after the victory at Sluys, he crossed the sea once more. This time his target was Normandy. He landed with a large army near the Cotentin Peninsula and began marching inland. The French king Philip VI was caught off guard. His forces were scattered. His nobles were unprepared. Edward moved fast, burning villages, seizing towns, and plundering the countryside. This was not just conquest. It was strategy. He wanted to draw the French into battle on his terms. Edward's army was well organized. It included knights, men-at-arms, and most importantly, thousands of longbowmen. These archers came from every part of England and Wales. They had trained since boyhood. Each week, by royal order, they had practiced the longbow in village fields. Now they stood ready to fight. The longbow was not a simple weapon. It was 6 feet tall and required immense strength to draw. But in the hands of a skilled archer, it was deadly. Its arrows could pierce armor. Its rate of fire was unmatched. This weapon would soon change the face of war. As Edward moved inland, the French king gathered his army. Philip VI summoned his nobles and vassals. Knights came from all corners of France, eager for glory. The French army grew in size over 30,000 men, many of them heavily armored. They hoped to trap Edward near the river Somme. For a time it seemed they would. The English were running low on supplies. The bridges were blocked. The French were closing in. But Edward found a way across at low tide. His army crossed quickly and escaped the trap. Now they turned to face their pursuers. On August 26, 1346, Edward chose a position near the village of Crécy. The land was ideal for defense. A gentle slope rose in front of them. Forests flanked their sides. The English army was outnumbered, but it was well positioned. Edward divided his forces into 3 parts. On one flank was his 16-year-old son, Edward of Woodstock, later known as the Black Prince. The king himself took the rear, ready to support where needed. Archers lined the front, their stakes planted to stop cavalry. Behind them stood the dismounted knights' weapons drawn. The French arrived later that day. Their forces were tired from marching. Their formation was loose, but their spirits were high. They believed they could crush the English with sheer numbers. Philip ordered an immediate attack. First came the Genoese crossbowmen mercenaries hired to lead the charge. They advanced, but they had no protection. Their shields had been left behind. As they moved forward, a sudden rainstorm struck. Strings on their crossbows grew wet and slack. Their bolts fell short. Then the sky darkened again, but this time not with clouds. English arrows rained down in deadly waves. The longbowmen fired fast, loosing 10 or 12 arrows per minute. The Genoese were cut down by the hundreds. Some turned and ran. The French knights watching from behind were furious. They called the Genoese cowards. In a frenzy, they charged forward straight through their own allies. Horses trampled men. Chaos spread. And still the arrows fell. Wave after wave of French cavalry charged the English lines. They were brave but disorganized. The narrow field channeled them into tight lanes. The ground became slick with blood and mud. Horses slipped, knights fell, archers picked them off from the flanks. Those who reached the English lines found themselves face to face with determined soldiers. Fighting was fierce, but the English held firm. They had dug pits and placed obstacles. The French couldn't break through. At one point, the French assault came close to overwhelming the right flank where the Black Prince fought. A message was sent to King Edward asking for reinforcements. The king, watching from a nearby windmill, asked if his son had fallen. The answer came, no. Then let him earn his spurs, Edward replied. He would not rob his son of glory. And the young prince did not fail. His men held their ground. The French charge broke apart once again. The battle continued for hours. The French refused to retreat. Again and again they hurled themselves forward. The English archers kept shooting. Piles of bodies formed where the charges had failed. Horses screamed. Armor clanged. The field became a graveyard. Among the fallen was King John of Bohemia, an old and blind monarch who had joined the French cause. He had his knights tie their horses to his and rode into battle. None of them returned. By nightfall, the French army was shattered. Thousands lay dead, including many of the kingdom's noblest lords. Estimates say that over 10,000 French soldiers perished. English losses were few, perhaps a few hundred at most. It was one of the most lopsided victories in medieval history. Crécy had shown that discipline and preparation could overcome raw numbers. It had also proven the power of the longbow. The impact of the battle was immediate. Edward moved north and laid siege to the port of Calais. After a long and difficult campaign, the city surrendered. England now had a permanent foothold on the continent. From Calais, armies could land resupply and launch future invasions. The war had entered a new phase. France was shaken, its army humiliated, its nobility decimated. Crécy was more than a battlefield victory. It was a turning point. The English had demonstrated a new way of fighting, less dependent on chivalry, more reliant on strategy and ranged power. The longbow became the symbol of English strength. French knights, once the masters of warfare, now faced a deadly new threat. The age of cavalry dominance was fading. A new age had begun. And so, with the smoke still rising from the fields of Crécy, Edward looked ahead. He had won a mighty victory. But the war was not over. There were more battles to come. more claims to defend, and more crowns to pursue. After the triumph at Crécy, England gained more than just land. It gained momentum. Edward III had shaken the French monarchy and shattered its armies. But even greater destruction would come not from kings, but from a prince. Edward of Woodstock, known to history as the Black Prince, would carry the war deep into France. His tactics were not based on conquest or honor. They were based on devastation. He would lead harsh campaigns across French soil. His weapon was fire. His goal was fear. By the early 1350s, the French kingdom was still recovering from the defeat at Crécy. Meanwhile, Edward III continued to press his claim to the French throne. His son, the Black Prince, had grown into a skilled and ruthless commander. He had learned the lessons of battle. He had fought at Crécy as a teenager. Now in his 20s, he was ready to lead armies of his own. His orders were clear: march into enemy territory, destroy everything of value, and weaken the French crown through chaos. The military strategy he used was called the chevauchée. It was not about capturing castles or fighting battles. It was about destruction. These were long raids covering hundreds of miles. The English would ride fast through the countryside, burning fields, villages, and supply depots. They would loot churches, destroy mills, and cut down orchards. The goal was to ruin the land, break the economy, and show the people that their king could not protect them. In 1355, the Black Prince launched one of his most infamous chevauchées. He led his army out from Bordeaux and rode east into the heart of southern France. His force included English knights, Gascon allies, and thousands of longbowmen. They marched in columns, burning as they went. Entire towns vanished in smoke. Fields of grain were turned to ash. Wells were poisoned. No army could stop them. The French forces were unprepared, and their leaders hesitated to engage the prince in open battle. The destruction was enormous. More than 500 towns and villages were destroyed. The region's tax revenues collapsed. Peasants fled in terror, leaving their homes and lands behind. Merchants lost everything. Roads became unsafe. For months, the raiders swept through the land. The prince did not stay in one place. He moved like a storm, fast, unpredictable, and merciless. His goal was not glory. It was to break France from within. The psychological impact of these campaigns was just as powerful as the physical damage. People began to doubt the strength of the French king. If he could not stop a foreign army from destroying their homes, then what good was his crown? Nobles feared rebellion. City leaders begged for protection. But the royal army moved slowly. The French military system relied on feudal levies which took time to gather. By the time soldiers assembled, the Black Prince was already gone. In 1356, the Black Prince marched again, this time northward. His army was smaller than before, but still dangerous. He hoped to force the French king into battle. The goal was to humiliate the Valois dynasty further, and perhaps even force a peace treaty. As he crossed rivers and burned villages, King Joan II of France began to chase him. The French army was large, over 20,000 men. The English force was less than half that size. But the prince was not afraid. The two armies met near the city of Poitiers. The ground was rough and hilly. The English took a defensive position, much like at Crécy. They set up stakes and traps. The longbowmen waited on the flanks. The French advanced in waves. Their crossbowmen were driven back quickly. Then came the cavalry charging with banners and lances. But the ground slowed them. Arrows rained down from the hills. Horses fell. Men were trapped. The French formations collapsed into confusion. Then the Black Prince struck. He ordered a flanking maneuver. A hidden force of mounted men charged from the rear. The French were caught between two fires. Panic spread. The King of France himself fought bravely, swinging a battle axe. But he was surrounded and captured. His nobles were either dead or fleeing. It was a complete disaster for France. Poitiers was worse than Crécy. With the king now a prisoner, France fell into chaos. A council ruled in his absence. Taxes rose. Lawlessness increased. Bands of mercenaries roamed the countryside, looting at will. The peasantry suffered the most. Many had already lost their homes in the prince's raids. Now they were subject to thieves, soldiers, and disease. The land was broken, and the war was far from over. The Black Prince returned to Bordeaux with his prize King John II. He treated the royal captive with honor, but demanded a heavy ransom. The French crown would struggle for years to pay it. In the meantime, Edward III pushed for even more concessions. He wanted more land. He wanted recognition of his claim. He wanted France brought to its knees. But despite his victories, the Black Prince's campaigns had consequences. His army had grown tired. Disease had spread among the troops. Supplies were scarce, and the devastation he caused had created hatred. Many Gascons, once loyal to England, now feared and resented their protectors. The prince's health also began to fail. He suffered from a wasting illness which grew worse each year. Still, the chevauchés had done their job. France was weakened both in spirit and in structure. Its economy had suffered a deep wound. Its king was in chains. Its people were afraid. And all of this had been accomplished without capturing a single capital city. The Black Prince had turned fire and fear into weapons. He had shown that war could be fought not just with swords, but with ashes. As the prince returned to England, his reputation was secure. He was a hero to his people, but to the French, he was a shadow of death. His name would be remembered for centuries, not just for victories, but for the ruin he left behind. In the late summer of 1356, the land of France trembled once again. After years of war and ruin, it faced yet another blow. This time the storm gathered near the city of Poitiers. The Black Prince Edward of Woodstock had returned to the field. Fresh from his devastating chevauchée across southern France, he now aimed to force the French king into battle. His army was smaller, but his tactics were sharp. He wanted a confrontation. He got one that would shake the French monarchy to its core. The campaign had begun like many others. The Black Prince set out from Gascony with around 6,000 men. They rode through the countryside in 3 columns. Villages burned, supplies were taken, towns were looted. Once again, the countryside of France turned to ash. But this time, the French king Jean II was ready. He had raised a large army, perhaps 20,000 strong. Nobles, knights, and levied troops marched under the royal banner. This time they wanted revenge. King Jean followed the English trail, closing the gap each day. His goal was to trap the enemy and destroy them. The Black Prince realized this and began pulling his troops back toward friendly ground. But his progress was slow. Some of his men were sick. Others were burdened with loot. And soon the French army caught up. The two forces finally stopped near Noailles, just south of Poitiers. The English found a good defensive position. They took the high ground between hedges, vineyards, and narrow lanes. Stakes were driven into the earth. Archers lined the slopes. Their horses were sent to the rear. The English prepared to fight on foot. It was a familiar pattern. They had done the same at Crécy. They hoped it would work again. The French army camped nearby. Their spirits were high. They outnumbered the enemy by more than 2 to 1. Their knights were eager. Many believed the English would surrender or be easily crushed. But there was disagreement. Some commanders urged caution. They remembered the disaster at Crécy. Others, driven by pride, pushed for immediate action. In the end, King Joan chose battle. On the morning of September 19th, 1356, the French army formed up in 3 lines. The vanguard advanced first, made up of crossbowmen and knights. But the English longbowmen struck before they could get close. Arrows flew in deadly arcs, piercing armor and dropping horses. The crossbowmen faltered. Panic spread. Then came the French cavalry charging uphill into narrow lanes. The terrain worked against them. Their formations broke apart. Riders were picked off one by one. Despite the chaos, the French kept attacking. Their second wave pushed forward, trying to reach the English lines. Hand-to-hand combat followed. Swords clashed. Men screamed. The Black Prince stayed in the center, directing his troops. His archers kept firing from the sides. The pressure was intense, but the English held. At a critical moment, the English launched a surprise attack from the flank. A hidden group of mounted troops had circled behind the French. They struck the rear like a hammer. The French lines buckled. Confusion turned into disaster. Some nobles fled. Others were surrounded. The battlefield became a trap. In the center, King Jean fought bravely. He wore fine armor and carried a battle axe. His royal banner waved above him. His youngest son stayed by his side. Surrounded, he refused to run. He defended himself until the end. But there were too many enemies. Eventually, he was pulled from his horse and taken prisoner. His capture stunned both armies. By late afternoon, the fighting was over. The French army was destroyed. Thousands lay dead. Many nobles had fallen. Others were captured. The English, though exhausted, had won a staggering victory. Just like at Crécy, their smaller force had defeated a much larger enemy. But this time they had also taken the king. The Black Prince treated his royal prisoner with great respect. King Jean was offered food, wine, and comfort. But his capture left France in chaos. There was no strong leader. Factions formed. The Dauphin, young Charles, tried to govern, but he lacked authority. The French treasury was empty. Mercenary bands roamed freely, pillaging what was left. The countryside sank deeper into ruin. In England, news of the victory caused celebration. The king's son had defeated the French once again. More than that, he had captured the ruler of a rival kingdom. The people rejoiced. Poitiers was seen as proof of English superiority. The ransom for King Jean would bring immense wealth. Talks began to release him. The price was set high, millions in gold. Negotiations followed, but peace was slow. The English wanted land money and recognition of Edward's claim to the French crown. The French offered some concessions, but not all. Meanwhile, the king remained a prisoner. He was brought to London, paraded with honor. He attended banquets. He met nobles, but he could not return home. Years passed. The Treaty of Bretigny was signed in 1360. It gave England new territories and a massive ransom for the king. In return, Edward III agreed for now to drop his claim to the French throne. King Joan returned to France, but his rule was weakened. His kingdom was in tatters. He had been defeated, humiliated, and ransomed like a common man. Poitiers was more than a battle. It was a turning point. It showed that France was vulnerable. It proved the power of English tactics, and it left a deep wound in the French spirit. Nobles questioned the crown. Peasants revolted. The economy collapsed. It would take decades to recover. And even then, the memory of that day when the King of France was taken from the battlefield would never be forgotten. Just as the war between England and France reached a violent peak, a silent enemy arrived. It did not wear armor or wave a banner. It did not follow borders, treaties, or kings. It came quietly, but its impact was greater than any army. The Black Death spread like wildfire, sweeping through towns, villages, and cities. In its path, it left sorrow, death, and fear. The war between the two kingdoms did not end, but it paused. Both sides, stunned by this new disaster, were forced to step back and survive. The plague arrived in Europe in late 1347. It traveled with merchants, rats, and fleas. Ships from the east brought it to the ports of Italy, and from there it spread outward in all directions. France was hit hard. The disease moved north, reaching major cities and the countryside alike. Paris, Lyon, and Bordeaux saw thousands of deaths. In some places, entire families perished within days. Priests, doctors, nobles, and peasants, none were safe. By 1348, the plague reached England. It entered through southern ports like Bristol and spread quickly. London, with its dense population, suffered terribly. Dead bodies filled the streets. The air smelled of rot and smoke. Bells tolled constantly. Mass graves were dug, and still there was not enough space. In villages, entire populations vanished. In some parishes, no one was left to ring the church bell or harvest the fields. The symptoms were horrifying. People developed painful swellings called buboes on their necks, groins, and armpits. Fevers ran high. Bleeding followed. Death often came within 3 days. Medical knowledge could not explain the disease. Some thought it was a punishment from God. Others blamed bad air planetary alignments, or even foreign merchants. Panic took hold. Many turned on each other. Pogroms broke out. Fear spread faster than the disease. In both England and France, the plague changed everything. Armies dispersed. Recruitment slowed. Tax collection collapsed. With so many people dead, governments could not function as before. Fields went unplanted. Markets emptied. Castles were abandoned. Even kings and princes had to retreat from public life. The Black Death did not end the war, but it made fighting it almost impossible. The death toll was enormous. Historians estimate that between one-third and one-half of Europe's population died. In some towns, the rate was even higher. In both England and France, millions perished. Families were torn apart. Churches lost entire congregations. Noble houses saw their lines vanish. The social order, already strained by war, began to crack. In the countryside, labor became scarce. Peasants who survived found that they had power for the first time. With so few workers, landlords had to compete for their labor. Wages rose. Old rules were challenged. In England, this led to new laws trying to freeze wages. In France, peasants were pressed to pay more taxes to fund the broken crown. Resentment grew. Eventually, it would lead to rebellion. The Black Death also altered religion. Many turned to the church for comfort, but found little. Priests died in large numbers. Monasteries emptied. Some began to question the authority of the church. Others sought new forms of worship. Flagellant movements appeared, groups who whipped themselves in public to seek forgiveness. People looked for meaning in a world turned upside down. For the kings of England and France, the plague was a disaster they could not fight. Edward III lost his daughter to the disease. In France, cities closed their gates hoping to escape infection. Royal courts shut down. Diplomacy stalled. Even trade between the countries slowed. The movement of goods soldiers and merchants became a risk. Ships were seen as carriers of death. Ports refused entry. Isolation became a common tactic. In this terrible silence, the war paused. Both sides had lost too much. Too many soldiers, too many peasants, too much money. For a time, there was nothing to fight with. Castles still stood. Borders still mattered. But the fire of war flickered low. It would return, but not until the plague had run its course. When the disease finally ebbed, nothing was the same. The world it left behind had changed. Population levels had collapsed. Farms stood empty. Villages disappeared from maps. But in that ruin, new structures began to emerge. Kings began to rethink their strategies. Peasants began to seek better lives. Merchants looked for new markets. The social fabric was rewoven with different threads. The Black Death also affected the balance of power. In France, the crown grew weaker. Local lords gained more control as the central government faltered. In England, Parliament gained influence as the king needed more funds to restore order. The plague had killed millions, but it had also shifted the foundations of society. The echoes of those changes would shape Europe for centuries. And yet, despite all this pain, the war would continue. Once the worst had passed, old rivalries returned. The English still claimed the throne of France. The French still resisted. New commanders would rise. New strategies would emerge. But for a few brief years, it was not the sword or the arrow that ruled, it was the sickness. And in those dark years, the war bowed its head before the power of death. When the tide of the plague began to recede, France was barely holding together. Its people were exhausted. Its lands were ruined. Its treasury was drained. For decades, English raids had burned villages, taken prisoners, and humiliated noble families. The king had been captured at Poitiers. The countryside was filled with mercenaries turned bandits. The kingdom was bleeding. But from this chaos, new leadership emerged. Charles V, the son of the defeated king, would rise to restore France. And by his side stood a warrior of humble birth, Bertrand du Guesclin. Charles V was not like his father. He was not a warrior. He rarely took part in battle. But he was smart, patient, and determined. He had grown up in a time of defeat and rebellion. He had seen the damage done to France. When he became king in 1364, he set out to change everything. His goal was to reclaim what had been lost, not just land, but dignity. The first step was to restore order at home. France had been overrun by so-called free companies, bands of mercenaries, who roamed the countryside. These men, once hired by kings and nobles, now fought for no one but themselves. They pillaged villages. They occupied castles. They made travel dangerous. Charles V began the slow task of breaking their power. Some were bought off. Others were hunted down. Bit by bit, France became safer. The second step was to reform the army. Charles knew that the old feudal model was failing. Knights who served for short campaigns were no longer enough. He needed a standing force, loyal, trained, and paid. He introduced the Compagnie d'Ordonnance, a new kind of military unit. These were professional soldiers hired by the crown and funded by new taxes. They were organized into companies with clear leadership and steady wages. It was a step toward modern warfare. To lead these forces, Charles turned to a remarkable figure, Bertrand du Guesclin. He was not born into nobility. He was a Breton of modest origins. His face was said to be rough, his manners coarse. But he was brave, cunning, and fiercely loyal. He had risen through the ranks by his own merit. He knew how to fight. He knew how to lead. And more importantly, he knew how to outsmart the enemy. Du Guesclin did not chase glory in open battle. He used ambushes, sieges, and surprise attacks. He wore down the English, avoiding the kind of full-scale battles that had led to French disaster in the past. His tactics frustrated the enemy. He struck at supply lines, retook castles, and defended key roads. His men respected him. The people admired him. Even his enemies grudgingly acknowledged his skill. Together, Charles V and Du Guesclin changed the course of the war. Slowly but steadily, they took back territory. Towns that had once flown English flags now returned to the French crown. Normandy, Anjou, Poitou. One by one, they came back under royal control. The English still held Calais and parts of Aquitaine, but their grip was slipping. Charles also used diplomacy as a weapon. He avoided reckless claims. He strengthened ties with Burgundy. He supported uprisings in English-held territories. He knew that war was not only won on the battlefield, but also in the minds of the people. If the French population could be turned back to the crown, the English position would collapse. And it did piece by piece. The French king also made smart use of money. He stabilized the coinage. He reformed taxes to ensure a steady flow of income. While the English struggled with debt and political division, Charles had the funds to support his soldiers. This financial stability gave him a critical advantage. He could keep his armies in the field longer. He could supply them better. He could plan campaigns over years, not just seasons. In 1370, Du Guesclin was named Constable of France, the highest military position in the kingdom. It was a reward for his loyalty and skill. From that point on, his reputation only grew. He led campaigns across Brittany, Normandy, and Gascony. He captured towns. He defeated English garrisons. His style was unorthodox, but it worked. He avoided disaster and delivered results. The English, by contrast, were beginning to falter. The Black Prince, once the hero of Crécy and Poitiers, had returned to England ill and weakened. His health was failing. His leadership declined. English resources were stretched thin. Political tension at home made it hard to raise funds. The once mighty momentum of Edward's campaigns began to slow. Meanwhile, Charles V pressed his advantage. He did not overreach. He avoided grand battles. He focused on strategy, not spectacle. His motto was time and patience, and those values paid off. By the late 1370s, much of France had been reclaimed. The war had turned. France was no longer on the defensive. It was fighting to win. Charles V died in 1380, but by then his legacy was secure. He had saved his kingdom from ruin. He had rebuilt its institutions. He had restored its pride. His reign proved that a king did not need to be a warrior to lead in war. He needed wisdom, vision, and the courage to act differently. As for Bertrand du Guesclin, he died the same year, still in service to the crown. He was buried with honors. His name became legend. In French history, he is remembered not just as a general, but as a symbol of resistance. He had taken a broken army and made it a force to be feared. He had fought not for glory, but for France. Their efforts did not end the war, but they changed its direction. For the first time in decades, France had the upper hand. The English would not recover easily. The tide had shifted. The fire of resistance had grown stronger, and the long road to victory had begun. By the early 15th century, the 100 Years' War had entered a quiet phase. After years of fierce battles and devastating raids, both sides had grown weary. England held on to Calais and some territories, but its influence in France had declined. France, though recovering, faced deep internal divisions. The Black Death had left its scars. Political instability and noble rivalries weakened the French crown. It was in this fragile moment that a new English king rose to power. His name was Henry the Fauve, and he came with bold ambition. Henry was young when he took the throne in 1413, but he was not inexperienced. He had fought in battles, led campaigns, and learned the ways of war. He was disciplined, devout, and determined to restore English prestige. One of his first goals was to revive his ancestors' claim to the French throne. The peace treaty signed decades earlier had left that claim unresolved. Henry saw an opportunity to press it again. He believed the French were weak. He believed God was on his side. In 1415, Henry sent envoys to the French court with demands. He asked for the return of Normandy, Anjou, and Aquitaine. He wanted recognition as the heir to the French throne. He requested a massive dowry with the hand of Princess Catherine. The French refused. They laughed at his proposals. One French prince even sent Henry a box of tennis balls, mocking him as a boy playing at war. Henry took the insult to heart. He began preparing for an invasion. That summer, a large English army gathered on the southern coast. Ships were loaded with supplies, weapons, and soldiers. Henry joined them in person. He was not a king who led from a distance. On August 11th, 1415, The fleet set sail across the Channel. It landed at the port of Harfleur in Normandy. The siege began immediately. The French resisted bravely, but after weeks of bombardment and hunger, the town surrendered. However, the victory came at a cost. Disease had spread through the English camp. Many soldiers died. The army was weakened. Despite this, Henry decided to march his troops across Normandy to Calais. It was a risky move. His men were tired. Supplies were low. The French were gathering a much larger force to block his path. But Henry pressed on. He believed that disciplined terrain and divine favor could carry the day. His army, around 6,000 strong, included heavily armored men-at-arms and thousands of longbowmen. These archers, trained from childhood, had proven their worth at Crécy and Poitiers. Now they would be tested again. The French army outnumbered the English at least 3-1. Estimates vary, but some believe as many as 20,000 troops stood against Henry's forces. The French nobles were confident. They had the numbers. They had the cavalry. And they believed they would crush the invaders. On October 24th, both armies camped near a small village called Agincourt. Rain fell during the night. The fields turned to mud. The stage was set. The morning of October 25th, 1415, was cold and wet. Henry's army took position in a narrow field flanked by woods. It was a defensive position. The English archers placed sharp stakes in the ground to stop cavalry charges. They waited silently. Across the field, the French lined up in massive formations. Their knights gleamed in armor. Their banners fluttered in the wind. Trumpets sounded. The battle began. The French cavalry charged first, galloping into the mud. But the field was too narrow. Their horses slipped. Arrows filled the air. The longbowmen fired in steady rhythm. Arrows punched through armor, struck eyes, and brought down riders. The cavalry was broken. Then came the French infantry, line after line of dismounted knights. They marched into the chaos, but the mud slowed them. The archers fired again and again. The French advance turned into a crush. The front ranks were pushed forward by those behind. Men fell and could not rise. Armor weighed them down. English troops moved in with swords and axes. The fighting was brutal. Blood mixed with mud. Some French lords surrendered. Others were killed where they stood. At one point, Henry feared his prisoners might regroup and attack from behind. He gave the grim order to execute them. By the end of the day, the field was littered with bodies. Thousands of French soldiers and nobles lay dead. Among them were the Duke of Alençon, the Constable of France, and many counts and barons. The English losses were light by comparison, perhaps a few hundred. It was a stunning victory. Against overwhelming odds, Henry had triumphed. News of Agincourt spread quickly. In England, the people rejoiced. Church bells rang. Songs were sung. Henry returned home a hero. His claim to the French throne now seemed not only legitimate, but destined. In France, the defeat caused shock and despair. The nobility had been decimated. Morale collapsed. The King Charles VI was already suffering from bouts of madness. His government grew weaker. Henry took full advantage. He returned to France in later campaigns, capturing more territory. He negotiated with the Burgundians, who had become powerful players in French politics. In 1420, the Treaty of Troyes was signed. It declared Henry as the heir to the French throne. He married Princess Catherine, daughter of King Charles VI. It seemed that his dream was becoming reality. But fate had other plans. Henry died suddenly in 1422, likely from disease. He was only 35. His infant son, Henry VI, inherited both the English and French crowns, but he was too young to rule. The unity of the two kingdoms began to unravel. Resistance in France grew stronger. A new figure would soon rise to challenge English rule. But for a brief moment, Agincourt had revived England's glory. It had shown the world that a small army led by a determined king could change the course of history. After the crushing victory at Agincourt, Henry V had become more than just a successful king. He had become a symbol of power, discipline, and divine favor. In England, his name was praised in churches and taverns. In France, it was whispered in fear. But Henry did not stop with one battle. He wanted something far greater than a victory on a muddy field. He wanted a crown. Not just the one on his own head, but the one that rested on the French throne. The opportunity came as France struggled with chaos. Its king, Charles VI, was alive but no longer truly ruling. His mind was broken. He suffered long periods of mental illness. At times, he didn't recognize his own family. He believed he was made of glass. He could not speak clearly. He could not make decisions. The government was in crisis. Nobles and princes fought among themselves. The two most powerful factions, the Burgundians and the Armagnacs, battled for control. France, once proud, was being pulled apart. Henry saw this as his moment. He returned to France with fresh troops and renewed purpose. Over the next 2 years, he moved methodically. City by city, he expanded English control. Normandy was his first target. Its people, once part of England's realm, remembered the past. Some towns welcomed him, others resisted. But resistance rarely lasted long. Henry was patient. He laid siege where needed. He rewarded loyalty. He punished betrayal. His reputation grew. Meanwhile, the civil war in France grew worse. In 1419, a shocking event changed everything. Joan, the fearless Duke of Burgundy and leader of the Burgundian faction, was assassinated. He had gone to meet with the Dauphin, the son of Charles VI, to discuss peace. But during the meeting, swords were drawn. The Duke was killed in front of his men. It was a political earthquake. The new Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good, was furious. He blamed the Dauphin. He turned his back on the royal heir, and he looked toward Henry. This shift was decisive. With Burgundy now on his side, Henry's power grew stronger. The Burgundians controlled Paris and much of northern France. Together, the English and Burgundians could control the heart of the kingdom. Secret negotiations began. Both sides wanted peace, but on their terms. For Henry, peace meant power. He demanded not only land and tribute, but succession. In May 1420, the Treaty of Troyes was signed. Its terms were stunning. King Charles VI remained king until his death. But after that, the crown would pass not to his son the Dauphin, but to Henry V and his heirs. Henry would marry Charles's daughter, Princess Catherine. Their children would rule both England and France. It was a diplomatic victory unlike any other. Henry had not just claimed the French throne, he had been named its future ruler by the king himself. The treaty was celebrated in English courts. It was seen as proof of Henry's brilliance and God's blessing. In France, it caused outrage. Many refused to accept it. The Dauphin declared it illegal. He claimed his father had been manipulated. His supporters rallied in the south. Still, Paris and much of the north were firmly in Anglo-Burgundian hands. The English flag flew above castles and towers. The treaty was real, and its effects were immediate. Henry and Catherine were married in June 1420. Their union was not just political, it was symbolic. English kings had long claimed ties to French royalty. Now that bond was sealed. The royal couple toured their new lands, appearing before crowds and nobles. Wherever they went, they brought a sense of order. But Henry knew peace would not last without strength. He kept his army close. He maintained sieges. He enforced laws with firmness. His leadership was constant. For a time, it seemed that the two crowns might truly unite. England and France, enemies for generations, now had a shared future. But history often turns with tragedy. In 1422, only 2 years after the treaty was signed, Henry fell ill. He was in the midst of another campaign when disease struck. He weakened quickly. His body could not recover. In August of that year, he died at the age of just 35. The shock was great. England had lost one of its greatest kings. France had lost its future ruler. Catherine was left a widow. Their only child, Henry VI, was a baby. Still, according to the treaty, the infant boy was now heir to both kingdoms. When Charles VI died 2 months later, Henry VI was crowned King of England and King of France. But a child cannot lead an empire. Regents were appointed. Power shifted. The Dauphin, though disinherited, refused to accept defeat. His followers grew stronger. They mocked the treaty as an English trick. Civil war continued. The dream of a united crown began to fade. Yet for that brief moment in 1420, the Treaty of Troyes stood as the high point of English ambition in France. It was not won by sword alone. It was won by strategy, alliance, and timing. Henry V had done what no English king before him had accomplished. He had been recognized as the rightful heir to the French throne by the French king himself. It was a political masterstroke. But like so many dreams born in war, it was short-lived. The war would continue. The crowns would remain divided. But the memory of Troyes, the hope it carried, and the boldness it represented would live on. It showed what could be gained not just through battle, but through diplomacy. And it marked the final rise of England's claim to France, before the long fall that was yet to come. By the early 1420s, the English held much of northern France. Their alliance with Burgundy had given them control of Paris and many key cities. The Treaty of Troyes had named Henry VI, a baby boy, the rightful king of both England and France. His uncle, the Duke of Bedford, ruled as regent. French resistance had been pushed south. The disinherited Dauphin Charles VII held a fragile court in Bourges. His enemies mocked him as the King of Bourges, a ruler without a crown or a capital. And yet hope had not died. In one of history's most extraordinary moments, that hope was reignited by a teenage girl from the countryside. Her name was Joan. Joan of Arc. Born in 1412 in the village of Domremy, she was the daughter of farmers. She could neither read nor write. She had never been taught warfare or politics. But from the age of 13, Joan began to hear voices. She called them saints. Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, Saint Margaret. They spoke to her, she said. They told her she had a mission to save France. At first, few believed her. A peasant girl claiming divine visions, it sounded like madness. But Joan was persistent. She traveled to Vaucouleurs, a local stronghold loyal to the Dauphin. She asked to be taken to the court. She declared that God had sent her. She told the captain there that she would help lift the siege of Orléans, a city under English attack. She was turned away. But she returned, again and again. Eventually, her passion and conviction moved hearts. She was given an escort and sent to Chinon, where Charles VII held court. She wore men's clothes to protect herself during the journey. When she arrived, she was tested. Charles disguised himself among his courtiers to see if she could find him. Joan walked straight to him. She said he was the true king chosen by God. The Dauphin was shaken. More tests followed by bishops, priests, and scholars. They questioned her faith. They examined her character. And finally, they believed. Charles gave her armor, a sword, and a banner. She took command of a small force and rode to Orléans. The city had been besieged by the English for months. Its walls were crumbling. Its people were losing hope. Joan's arrival was like a spark in dry wood. Morale surged. Crowds cheered. Soldiers rallied. She did not fight with a sword, she carried her banner. She led from the front, urging the troops to trust in God. Her presence changed everything. The French launched a series of bold attacks. They stormed English forts surrounding the city. Joan was wounded by an arrow, but returned to the field. Her courage inspired the men. She spoke with clarity. She prayed with them. She called for repentance and faith. Within days, the English lines broke. Their troops withdrew. On May 8, 1429, the siege of Orléans was lifted. It was a miracle, at least, to the people of France. For years, they had suffered defeat after defeat. Now they had triumphed, and they had done so under the leadership of a girl who said she spoke with angels. Joan became a symbol. She rode through towns in white armor. She spoke with kings and peasants. She urged Charles to act, to move north and claim his crown. He listened. Joan led the army through the Loire Valley. Victories followed at Jargeau, Monts-sur-Loire, and Patay. At Patay, the English suffered heavy losses. Their famed longbowmen were overrun by French cavalry. The tide had truly turned. Joan then pressed the Dauphin to go to Reims, the traditional site of coronation. The city was deep in enemy territory, but as the French army approached, towns opened their gates. People rejoiced. On July 17, 1429, Charles was crowned King of France. Joan stood at his side, her mission fulfilled, or so it seemed. But the war was not over. Joan wanted to march on Paris. Charles hesitated. Political advisors urged caution. They feared losing what had been gained. A partial attack on Paris failed. Joan was wounded again. She returned to the field, but without full support. Her power was fading not because she was less brave, but because the court grew wary. She was a commoner with great influence. Some saw her as a threat. In 1430, Joan was captured while defending the town of Compiègne. She fell into the hands of the Burgundians who sold her to the English. Her enemies rejoiced. They wanted her silenced, not just as a military figure, but as a symbol. The English feared that her fame would spark more rebellions. They put her on trial for heresy. The trial was long and brutal. Joan stood alone. She had no lawyers, no allies, only a small cell and harsh interrogators. They accused her of witchcraft, false prophecy, and dressing like a man. She defended herself calmly. She spoke with clarity and confidence. Even her judges were impressed. But the verdict had already been decided. In May 1431, Joan was declared guilty and burned at the stake in Rouen. She was only 19 years old. Her death shocked the world. Crowds wept. Even some of her enemies felt shame. But her legacy could not be destroyed. In the years that followed, Charles VII slowly reclaimed more territory. Joan's memory lived on. In 1456, a new trial declared her innocent. Centuries later, she was declared a saint. Joan of Arc had entered the war like a flash of light. She brought hope where there was none. She united a broken people. She reminded them of faith, purpose, and courage. In a war of kings and crowns, she had no title, only conviction. And with that, she changed history. Joan of Arc's death was meant to silence hope. Her trial was staged to break the spirit of a nation. English leaders believed that by burning her, they would erase her influence. But instead, they made her a martyr. The flames that rose over Rouen lit a fire in the hearts of the French. Across towns and villages, people spoke of her courage. Her death did not weaken the cause, it gave it new strength. When Joan died in 1431, France was still divided. The north remained under English control, protected by their Burgundian allies. Paris flew the enemy's banner. The south and center stayed loyal to Charles VII, the disinherited prince who had become king in Reims. But his rule was fragile. He lacked money soldiers and full recognition. Even some of his own nobles questioned his power. Yet the image of Joan young, pure, fearless, became a symbol he could not ignore. Though Charles had once hesitated to fully support her, he now understood the depth of her sacrifice. He allowed prayers in her name. He heard from towns that spoke of her as a saint. Common folk believed she had been sent by God. Her visions, her victories, her trial all became part of a larger story. And in that story, Charles was no longer a weak claimant. He was the chosen king, the one whom Joan had served with her life. In the years after her death, Charles moved carefully. He avoided bold attacks. Instead, he focused on rebuilding his armies and winning back his people. He reformed taxes. He restructured command. He brought order to regions once ruled by fear and bandits. Slowly, loyalty returned. Joan's story was repeated from town to town. Her voice still echoed though she was gone. The English, by contrast, began to falter. Their young king, Henry VI, was a child. His court was divided between rival factions. Ambition and distrust ran high. Resources grew thin. The alliance with Burgundy, once powerful, began to weaken. Philip, the good Duke of Burgundy, had never truly forgiven the English for letting Joan be burned without trial by neutral parties. He began to rethink his allegiance. Charles saw this shift and seized the moment. In 1435, the Treaty of Arras was signed. It was a massive turning point. Burgundy broke ties with England, and recognized Charles VII as the true king of France. This political earthquake shook English control. Without Burgundian support, their grip on northern France began to slip. Paris, the heart of the kingdom, remained under English control. But now it was vulnerable. Over the next few years, Charles launched a series of strategic campaigns. He didn't rush. He chose targets, carefully reclaiming towns, securing roads, restoring order. Each victory brought more confidence. More men joined his side. Nobles who had once stood back now pledged their loyalty. In 1436, Paris was retaken. French forces entered the capital without a major battle. The city was tired of occupation. People opened gates, welcomed soldiers, and sang songs of joy. Bells rang out. Crowds filled the streets. Joan had once dreamed of this moment. Now, though she was gone, her vision had come true. As France united, Charles's authority grew. No longer the king of Bourges, he was now king in fact and name. His reign stretched from the Loire to the Seine, from Reims to Bordeaux. But his greatest triumph was not on a battlefield. It was in the hearts of his people. They no longer doubted. They believed. In 1450, the English suffered a major defeat at Formigny. Normandy, their stronghold, began to fall. 2 years later, the French retook Gascony. By 1453, the last English garrison in Bordeaux surrendered. The 100 Years' War had come to its final phase. England, once dominant, had lost almost everything. Only Calais remained in their hands, and even that would fall decades later. Throughout this final chapter, the memory of Joan remained alive. Her name was spoken with reverence. Her story was carved into churches and painted onto walls. Soldiers invoked her before battle. Mothers told their children of the girl who had once ridden through fire and fear to save their king. She had died, but her cause had lived on. In 1456, a retrial was held in Rouen. It was ordered by Charles VII. Witnesses spoke. Records were reviewed. Judges ruled that the original trial had been unjust. Joan was declared innocent. Her name was cleared. The king had kept his promise. The stain was removed. Justice, though late, was done. The coronation of Charles VII in Reims, made possible by Joan's courage, had marked the turning point in the war. But her death gave it meaning. She had shown that even in darkness, faith could shine. That a girl with no sword, no crown, and no title could change the fate of nations. Her martyrdom had united France when nothing else could. As the war drew to a close, France was no longer a scattered patchwork of regions. It was a kingdom, strong, central, and proud. And though her flag bore the fleur-de-lis in every corner of the land, there was still a place in the heart of France for Joan. Her courage had lit the path, and the crown she helped place upon Charles's head now rested more firmly than ever before. By the early 1450s, the long war that had consumed generations was drawing to its final act. France, once torn and scattered, now stood strong under Charles VII. His armies had reclaimed vast regions. His government had stabilized. Towns had returned to royal rule. The people, once lost in fear and doubt, had found hope again. Across the Channel, England was unraveling. Its young king, Henry VI, was weak. His court was divided, and his kingdom, still grieving the loss of its golden warrior, King Henry V, could no longer bear the weight of empire. The final English stronghold in France was Gascony. This region had once been a jewel of English power. Its vineyards, trade routes, and loyal towns had funded wars and supplied kings. But now even this last bastion was slipping away. French forces had begun a steady campaign to retake the region. Their goal was not only military, it was symbolic. They wanted to end the war where it had begun and close the door to England's dreams forever. In 1451, the French captured Bordeaux, the capital of Gascony. It was a heavy blow to English pride. But the loss was not permanent yet. In 1452, John Talbot, Earl of Shrewsbury, and a legendary English commander, returned to France with fresh troops. He retook Bordeaux in a swift campaign. The people, many of whom had old ties to England, welcomed him. For a moment it seemed the war might reignite. Talbot was a veteran of many battles. He had fought across France for decades. Brave and determined, he believed in the old glory. But he faced a new enemy. The French army was no longer what it had been in the days of Crécy or Poitiers. It was professional, organized, and well-equipped. It used artillery. It followed commanders who understood modern war. And now it marched south to meet Talbot one last time. In July 1453, near the small town of Castillon, the two armies met. Talbot had around 6,000 men. The French, under Jean Bureau, numbered closer to 10,000. But the real difference was not in numbers, it was in weapons. The French had set up a fortified camp surrounded by trenches and protected by over 300 cannons. These guns, primitive but deadly, were placed behind earthworks and ready to fire. Talbot believed he could take the camp by surprise. He ordered an attack. His men charged forward. The French fell back into their defenses. Talbot, confident, pushed harder. But the French had laid a trap. Their artillery opened fire. Cannonballs tore through ranks. Horses fell screaming. Men were cut down in droves. It was one of the first battles in Europe where gunpowder played a decisive role. Despite the chaos, Talbot fought on. He led from the front as he always had. He was nearly 80 years old, but fearless. His son, young John Talbot, rode beside him. Father and son charged again and again, but they could not break the French lines. The field turned into a slaughter. English troops were trapped in the mud, pounded by guns, and surrounded. When the French counterattacked, the English formation collapsed. Talbot was killed in the fighting. So was his son. Their bodies lay among thousands of fallen soldiers. The English survivors fled. Some tried to hide. Others were captured. By the end of the day, the English army in Gascony was destroyed. Castillon was not just a defeat, it was the final curtain. The war that had begun in 1337 now had its final battlefield. After the victory, the French quickly moved to reclaim Bordeaux. The city surrendered. There were no more armies left to send. England, distracted by internal strife, could not respond. The Wars of the Roses were about to erupt, a bitter civil war that would tear England apart for decades. France, meanwhile, stood united. The last English soldier had left its soil. Except for Calais, all French land was now in French hands. The defeat at Castillon crushed England's imperial dream. For over a century, English kings had believed they could rule both sides of the Channel. They had won great battles. They had claimed great titles. But in the end, the dream had faded. The price had been too high, the politics too messy, the resistance too strong. The 100 Years' War had changed both kingdoms. England emerged with a weakened crown and growing parliamentary power. It had lost land money and prestige, but it had gained something else, a clearer sense of itself. Without its French territories, it turned inward. Its national identity began to form. Its culture, language, and politics evolved. The age of English empire in France was over. France, meanwhile, had risen from the ashes. It had endured invasions, plagues, civil war, and famine. But under Charles VII, it had found unity. The royal army had become a powerful tool. The monarchy had reasserted control. Local lords were brought into line. A new France was born, centralized, disciplined, and proud. The memory of the war lingered. Songs were written. Chronicles were recorded. Monuments were built. But in Castillon, the fields grew quiet again. Grass covered the earth where cannon had roared. Farmers returned to rebuild what had been lost. The war was over. The wounds would take years to heal. But at last the killing had stopped. The English dream of ruling France had died with Talbot. And though many in England still mourned the loss, others looked to the future. Across the sea, the island kingdom would face its own storms. But in that moment, as the sun set over Gascony, the war that had lasted more than 100 years was finally done. The 100 Years' War began as a feud between kings, but by the time it ended, it had remade a kingdom. In the year 1453, with the guns of Castillon falling silent, France stood transformed. What had once been a fragmented realm of dukes and rival lords was now something far more powerful, a centralized monarchy with a renewed sense of identity. The war had brought ruin, yes, but it had also brought change. Out of fire and blood, a modern France had been born. Before the war, the French king's authority was limited. Powerful dukes ruled large regions as if they were independent states. Some collected taxes, raised armies, and even made foreign alliances. The king was more a figurehead than a ruler. His power stopped where a strong noble's walls began. The war, long and painful, broke that balance. It showed that only a united front could survive against a foreign threat. Piece by piece, the crown reclaimed its authority. Charles VII had started this process. After reclaiming Paris and driving out the English, he focused on rebuilding. He created the first standing army in French history. No longer would the king rely solely on nobles to raise troops. Instead, he hired professional soldiers, well-trained, regularly paid, and loyal to the crown. This force gave the monarchy new strength. It allowed the king to defend his realm without begging for support. To fund this army, Charles introduced new taxes. The taille, a direct tax on the people, became a steady source of income. At first, it was unpopular, but as stability returned, many accepted it. They saw that the money went to protect towns' roads and harvests. It was the price of peace. Over time, the royal treasury became more reliable. The king no longer needed to depend entirely on the goodwill of his lords. The government also evolved. Royal councils grew more professional. Scribes, lawyers, and accountants replaced aging nobles in many roles. Bureaucracies expanded. The law became more consistent across the kingdom. The king's courts reached into villages and towns that had once answered only to local lords. Slowly, the idea of national law began to take shape. The monarchy's image changed too. In the early days of the war, kings were often absent or ineffective, but Charles VII and later Louis XI proved that a king could lead, govern, and plan. They were not just symbols, they were administrators and strategists. Royal authority came to be seen not just as divine but as practical, something that could be felt in every town tax office, every military post, and every courtroom. The French people changed as well. A new sense of identity emerged. They had seen their land invaded, their cities burned, their sons taken to war. But they had also seen it reclaimed. The memory of Joan of Arc, the coronation of Charles in Reims, and the expulsion of the English all became part of a shared story. Being French now meant more than speaking a dialect or obeying a local lord. It meant loyalty to the crown, to the land, and to the future. Even the nobility adapted. Some resisted. Others embraced the changes. They realized that working with the crown could bring rewards. Titles, lands, and honors flowed from Paris to those who supported the king. A new elite emerged, nobles who held courtly manners, royal favor, and bureaucratic power. They replaced older warrior families who had resisted reform. It was the birth of a new ruling class. The church also played a role. During the war, bishops had helped hold regions together. Now they supported the monarchy's push for unity. Churches promoted royal authority from the pulpit. Religious festivals celebrated peace and kingly success. The monarchy began to be seen as not only legal and political, but sacred. Kings were chosen by God, and they now ruled like it. Outside the cities, peasants too felt the changes. Life had been hard. Raids, taxes, and famine had scarred the countryside. But in the decades after the war, many saw improvements. Markets reopened, trade returned, roads became safer. The king's men enforced laws and punished bandits. Local lords, once above the law, now answered to royal courts. For many, the war had brought horror, but the peace it left behind brought something close to hope. France's transformation wasn't complete. There were still challenges. Distant regions remained restless. Foreign wars would come again. But the seeds had been planted. The idea of a strong, centralized monarchy had taken root. The French crown, once fragile, now stood firm. And while England slipped into civil war, France moved forward. The years after 1453 saw kings who built roads, repaired bridges, and strengthened borders. Diplomats replaced knights. Letters replaced swords. The country began to act like a state, not just a collection of fiefs and feuds, but a nation with a plan. In many ways, the 100 Years' War had been a nightmare. A century of conflict, millions dead, fields ruined, families broken. But from that nightmare came a new morning. France had endured. And more than that, it had grown, stronger, smarter, united. The war had begun over claims and crowns. It had ended with something far more lasting, the birth of modern France.